Hey everyone, Curse Deck Builder here, making our way to 10,000 decks assisted, and here we have Inniaz, the Gale Force Flying Tribal, that comes to us from Dakota, who has supported the channel to bring this deck list to the front of the queue. Thank you so much. I really do appreciate the support, Dakota. So, let's read the message that Dakota has sent along with Inniaz. They're looking for just general suggestions, meant to be a fun, wacky flying tribal that can mess up people's game plans. Would like to maybe add some of the flicker cards to protect my entire board, as it seems weak to wipes, and maybe add some more negates just to protect myself. Made this list a while ago and kind of never got back to it, as after looking through all the flying cards for hours, and by the end of it, I got bored of all the cards doing the same thing, but I think it will be fun if put together right. I do understand that sentiment, and I'll go into it in a second, but first, as always, this deck list will be in the video description below. If you ever wanted to build, and I mean ever, wanted to build Flying Tribal, this deck right here is a fantastic example of Flying Tribal. And let's see, it says about $162 American. If you wanted to, you could probably just buy this deck as is, and you would have a very good time. There's only a few cards that I don't particularly like here, and they're not very, they're rare. I think the deck itself is very, very strong. It does exactly what it sets out to do. And in that way, I can also see if it's a little boring to build. See, I have a bit of a feeling on tribal decks. I do feel sometimes they can be kind of too streamlined, and they do just exactly that one thing rather well. But, Dakota, you have nothing to worry about. I have some suggestions that might spice up the deck and make it a little more fun, which can go in one of two directions as well. But before we get there, let's take a look at Inniaz and let's see what they do and why we're using them. So Inniaz is a 4/4 Jin in 5 mana in blue, however, has an activated ability with white, which is what makes them a white-blue commander. They fly, and they have an ability that says, for 2 and a white or a blue, attacking creatures with flying get +1/+1 until end of turn, which is okay, but not really why you're playing it. You are playing them for the second ability that says, whenever 3 or more creatures you control with flying attack, each player gains control of a non-land permanent of your choice controlled by the player to their right. So what does that mean? That means you pick 4 permanents that aren't lands on the battlefield, and everyone moves them one space to the left. So as if going forward in turn order. So you give your permanent to the person who's next in turn order, they give theirs to the next one to their left, and so on and so forth. So everything does a bit of a rotation. And the idea is generally, in a deck like this, we want to give our opponents like 1/1 birds and pull some really cool stuff from them. So before we get into all the fun that ability can have, we can take a look here where we have a pretty straightforward and, like I said, very strong flying tribal deck. Let's take a look at the curve, and we can see it curves out rather nicely. We have 2 permanents at 7 mana, Wind Raider Phoenix, which represents a torrential amount of card draw, and therefore I think is valuable at 7 mana. And on the other hand, Sephara, oops, did not need to click, Sephara, who costs 1 white and 4 untapped flying creatures to be tapped, and not 7 mana, which makes her a lot more castable, which makes this a lot more reasonable at 1 7-mana permanent. I see in the sideboard we have an option of Elish Norn. I would be okay with putting Elish Norn in here, but we'd probably have to take out the Wind Reader Phoenix. Ooh, the Wind Reader Phoenix in exchange for Elish Norn. There's a lot of card draw, so you will be hitting your land drops, but 7 turns and a few less with some ramp is still a lot. But that being said, Elish Norn is exceptionally strong. I'm always singing her phrases here. And once again, specifically Elish Norn, Grand Cenobite. This is this is just a lot of power that you can add to your side of the board, and a lot of power that you're detracting from your opponent's side of the board to the point that you might be destroying creatures with it. Very, very strong card. So I do understand why that's in the side. And I think if you really wanted to, I think it would be fine to switch for Wind Reader. I think you're already drawing enough cards. But let's do the thing where let's quickly look at the 5-drops. We have quite a few 5-drops that match Inniaz the Gale Force. And as we've said before, 5-drop, the same mana slot as our commander, can be tricky because these cards will sometimes compete with our commander. Now here's the thing. In the current build of the deck, you don't have to play Inniaz. You play Inniaz when the setup is right and you have things to steal or things to give to your opponent, which is not very often in this deck. But when it does, it's incredibly easy to trigger because you summon Inniaz and you immediately attack with 3 creatures to get the trigger. So Inniaz doesn't have to come out at the 5-drop. But even then, let's take a quick look. Defiler of Dreams is obviously incredibly powerful in this deck because not only does it reduce the mana cost on all your blue birds, it also makes them draw a card every time you play them. This, of course, is not including your other blue permanents, such as your enchantments that are blue. So absolutely keep Defiler of Dreams. Kangi's Sky Warden, I think is fine. It's kind of like a lord that when it attacks will boost all of your flyers. I think it's fine. I think it's definitely weaker than the other options, but I do think it's still worth it. Just barely, though. Let's look at our other ones before we come back, and maybe this is the weakest one. Muldrifter, I'm going to count Muldrifter as sometimes it's a 3-drop, so I don't think that's particularly bad. And so I don't think there's a lot of competition. And when you do want to cast it as a 5-drop, you don't really have a lot of blink or anything like that. I think the main benefit is that you can reduce its mana cost from 3 to like 2 or 1, and then it's a really good card. But I don't think you're casting this fairly outside of Evoke, so I wouldn't count this as a 5-mana card. Migratory Root has land cycling, so we shouldn't worry too much about that, because sometimes it'll just be cycled. Time Wipe is a pretty straightforward board clear, so I think it is worth the power of it. But even then, I think you could probably just get away with Wrath of God instead and avoid it being the same mana cost as our commander. I don't think there's particularly a singular bird or, well, I guess they're almost all birds, or creature that you want back in your hand. So I think you'll be pretty happy just ignoring that, instead putting, even Supreme Verdict would be a really nice choice here. Access Denied is really interesting because it does make a bunch of flyers for CMC, but I don't particularly like this here because 5 mana is a lot to hold up when you don't have a lot of instants. You have 9 instants, I believe, and I say I believe, I can just scroll up and find out. Yeah, you have 9 instants, and so you're not holding up mana very often. And if a turn cycle comes by, I know this is talked about a lot about the 5 mana spells that, counter spells that give you something on what you counter, is that if you don't hit the right spell, you get really far behind, and you don't want to play a 5 mana instant counter target spell, put 2 1/1s into play. Maybe you do. I just think this one's really suspect, so I probably wouldn't play it. And Gravitational Shift is really, really interesting. We're gonna come back to Gravitational Shift, but long and short, I think it's absolutely worth playing. So after having looked at Time Wipe and Access Denied, I think Kangi is probably worth playing. I think that's fine. So let's look at any other cards that kind of stand out as interesting choices. Namely, Benevolent Offering was one of the first things that caught my eye. I do understand the power here. You're going to pick an opponent, and you and that opponent are going to make 3 flyers, and then you and another opponent are going to gain life. We're not really playing it for that part. We're playing for the create the 3 1/1s, because that happens to be the exact number of 1/1s we need in order to trigger Inniaz, and then we go from 4 to 5 mana the next turn and immediately cast Inniaz and trigger it. Having said all of that, maybe I do still like it. I guess it feels kind of bad when outside of that scenario, Like when you have to play this card fairly and give someone 3/1/1s, especially the longer the game goes on, I think the less attractive this card is. So, yeah, okay, I'm still going to be harsh on it. I'm going to say I don't think this card is particularly good here. I think it's just outside of the niche where, or the niche scenario where you cast this on 4 and play a commander on 5, you're going to be generally unhappy to draw this card. So I would take it out for sure. Looking around a little more, Pendant of Prosperity is so much fun. I really love the fact that you can give it to your opponent that's to the right of you, and then give it back to yourself. And so you get to basically trigger its activated ability twice. I have nothing more to say. Obviously, it stays in the deck, but I just did want to point that out to someone who may have looked at the deck and not noticed that. That is so cool, and I really, really like it. So, really nice choice there. Outside of this, nothing else is particularly bothersome. 9 lives feels a bit suspect. I'm going to make an argument again for it a bit later. But before I make that argument, I'm going to suggest that 9 lives by itself in this deck right here isn't very good. It's kind of tricky for you to give it to an opponent and then bounce it or destroy it. And there's a lot of things that can go wrong. Because if you're playing against a certain setup, let's say, like, for example, if someone has, um, my goodness, what is that spell? Oh, you're not playing it yourself. The 2 mana overload Cyclonic Rift. If someone has Cyclonic Rift, which you really should be playing with 9 lives, because the main idea I think would be to give this to someone and then Cyclonic Rift, which would then knock them out of the game, is that when you play this, if it's not being played on curve, when you go to give it to someone else, an opponent can Cyclonic Rift and take it out of the game, and that would knock you out of the game. And so it just feels like a vulnerability you don't need on a card that you can't really capitalize on. So 9 lives kind of sticks out as kind of a weird inclusion here. Spirit Bonds and Haunted Library as well are kind of weird inclusions. They're not they're not bad. It's just they require a lot of mana. And though this deck is really good at drawing cards, it's not fantastic at producing tons of mana. Like, we can look at situations where, let me see. I am looking for one of our reducers. Warden of Evo's Isles will reduce the mana cost of flying creatures by 1. So, we can cast Aven Mind Sensor for 2, and then when it enters the battlefield, we can use Spirit Bond, and pay 1 white to get a spirit out of it. So we've effectively gone neutral at mana cost to get an additional 1/1 flyer. And that's fine, but if we don't have the Warden of Evo's Isle, then we're not getting that. We're actually adding a mana cost to each of our cards. And I think already we're kind of tight, like I said before. Same thing, and with Haunted Library, we need to hold up mana as well when our opponent's creatures die. I just don't think this is the kind of deck that can hold up mana for these kind of things. So they kind of stand out to me as cards I don't particularly like. Let's see. That's generally it. 34 lands feels right. The amount of card draw in this deck is actually kind of ridiculous. I really do like it. Like, you're going to go through your deck very, very quickly. Actually, I just scroll over a Maria Angel. I think a Maria Angel is kind of weak. Just everything else kind of works so well together. And because of that, something like this just feels kind of wrong. Like, a land for a 1/1 is just kind of weak, whereas you have so many other ways of just putting better flyers into play that do more. So Mary Angel is also something I take out. Okay, so those are my general changes, and now I'm going to go and tell you about some additions. I have 2 very straightforward additions, and then I have fun additions that can spice up the deck. The 2 main additions that come to mind, since you said you haven't worked on the deck for a while, would be Goldforged Thopterix. 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 It's a dinosaur thopter. Flying Lifelink. Each legendary permanent you control has Ward 2. Now, you don't have a crazy amount of legendary permanents, but you definitely have a few. let's see, Kira's over here, Linvala's here, Donell is here, or Donal. Then we have Kangi, then we have Safara, and obviously Inniaz, if I haven't mentioned that already. That's more than enough. Like, I would play this card just for my commander, and I think that's fine. I think it's a fine creature. It gives a nice little boost. You have other cards that kind of do similar things, where they tax your opponent's mana costs or their ability to kind of deal with your cards nicely, such as obviously Judge's Familiar, Kira, and I believe there was one more that I saw that I guess, let's see. I guess I'm not going to be able to find right now, but I do remember there was one more. There we go. Jubilant Skybonder, which also taxes our opponents. So these cards work really, really well together to further tax our opponents to make it difficult for our opponents to deal with our cards. Now, our second card that I'd like to add that I think belongs here is Invasion of Gobakhan. So this invasion, when it enters the battlefield, you're going to exile a card from one of your opponent's hands. Notably, it does not have to be the opponent who is asked to defend this card. Those are two separate things. You look at their hand, you exile a card, it costs two more for the rest of the game, which is really, really nice. And then on transform, and this is a really easy, it's 3, it has defense 3, so it's really easy to break the siege. You get Light Shield Array, which is incredibly powerful in this deck because it will grow your birds turn after turn to make them into very big threats. Because that's kind of the difficulty with birds, is most of them are rather weak. And then you, as long as you have it out, you can sacrifice it at any point, right? And then all of your creatures get indestructible and hexproof, protecting you from 4-way. And to answer your question about wanting to put more blink in here, I think I would really rather have a little more indestructibility instead of blink. I think it just works a little better because you do create enough tokens that I think you'd be losing those tokens with blink. So when we think of cards such as creatures you control gain indestructible in white blue, I think there's a few that come to mind immediately. Let's do mana value. Choose a creature type. Unfortunately, that's not a bird. You could say bird, but you're not going to get everything. So instead, I think they do kind of start at Flawless Maneuver. I believe is a little expensive, just got reprinted, but could fit in here very, very well. I should check if you're playing already. You are not. So that would be a very, very easy inclusion. After that, I would also consider Unbreakable Formation, or your temple is under attack. And then if you really want to, the highest I would go is Achroma's Will, because that is a really fun finisher in your colors that can put you very, very far ahead. So indestructibility seems a little more interesting to me than Blink, and Invasion of Gobakhan does this really, really well and powers up the deck. All right, so those are my reasonable inclusions. Let's get a little unreasonable here. Let's get a little silly. Once again, I'm not trying to imply that this deck is unfun to play. It's just really consistent at what it does. And if that's what you want, you're going to have a really, really good time. But as you've said, when you look through the birds, they kind of all do the same thing. And what they do really well. But we have a whole other bit of text of Inniaz, and we should really be taking advantage of it. And that is our ability to give cards and take cards from our opponents. So initially, I was trying to think of cards that we want to donate to our opponents. The problem is there's not many, and they're not very good because most of them you have to cast them fairly. You have to deal with them on your side of the field. And then when you give it to someone, it only puts them a little, a little behind. Most of the time, it's like 9 lives where you have to flicker it out or something else to get the effect. And even then, sometimes it doesn't really do much. Most of the abilities we want to donate tend to be in other colors, namely red and black. So this aspect of donate doesn't work really well. But then I saw gravitational shift, and I had an idea. Do you notice anything about gravitational shift? Well, If you're like me, the first thing you notice is you realize that its effect is not dependent on who controls the card. It is not yours. It is just a static effect that affects the board no matter where it is. So Gravitational Shift is a fantastic card to pass to the left because the player getting it doesn't gain any abilities or effects that they didn't already have, right? If they had flyers, they were already boosted, and if they didn't have flyers, they were already weakened. So I wanted to find cards like this. Now, the easiest ones that I'm going to include right away are cards where it straight up doesn't matter who controls it and are very playable. Cards like Darksteel Mutation, the owner of the aura doesn't actually matter. You cast this on someone's commander, and then you give the person to your left control over Darksteel Mutation. Nothing changes. And in fact, if you are being specific and you want that player not to give a more powerful card to the left, you can keep passing around Darksteel Mutation and keep, only being the one who benefits, at least for that card or that ship. The other version of this, of course, is Imprisoned in the Moon. Same kind of effect. Both of these cards are really, really underestimated, I think. I think there was for a while, there was this attitude or this idea that these cards were really, really strong. And then people just forgot about it, I think. But the ability to cast this on, especially Imprisoned in the Moon, onto a red-black player or a player that doesn't have, a color red, black, blue, like any of those that doesn't have easy enchantment removal, and you cast this on their commander, you have effectively shut out their commander for the majority of the game. And even certain decks that do have a commander that can get around, or do have cards that get around enchantments, it's not necessary that they don't necessarily have that removal card in their hand, and in the meantime, their commander is a waste, right? Or a bug. And once again, same rule, whoever has control of this aura doesn't really matter. What matters is the effect on the creature it's attached to. And one more of that kind of example, just summing up, any kind of O-ring effect has the same kind of rule. It doesn't matter who controls the O-ring as long as the O-ring stays in play. Now, obviously, when I'm saying these cards can be passed around, there are some caveats, right? If you're playing against a player that has a sacrifice any kind of permanent ability, and they're to your left, you might just be happier giving them burns, right? If they would choose to sacrifice the Oblivion Ring, it might not be so good for you. But I think those kind of decks or abilities are kind of rare, especially sacrifice permanents. Even more so, sacrificing enchantments are kind of hard to do. And with that in mind, you can pass this around without much trouble. So those are kind of the neutral options of this kind of deck that you can use to pass around. But what if you didn't want to be neutral? What if you wanted to be, well, kind of mean? Well, let's look at cards like this that are a little sharper. Rule of Law says each player can't cast more than one spell a turn. Likewise, over here, Deafening Silence says each player cannot cast more than one non-creature spell a turn. Both of these, easy to pass around and have no cost. Have no downside depending on who owns the card. It still has the effect. And I'm going to give a bunch more examples of these kind of cards. And the thing is, some of these cards will work the deck. For example, it's pretty obvious that if you're playing Deafening Silence, you might want to limit the kinds of non-creature spells you have. You are a creature deck by far, so you will be less effective. And all that would happen would be like you could play Darksteel Mutation because you get to play your one non-creature, and then you can play some creatures with Deafening Silence. Alternatively, with Rule of Law, you do have to play around the fact that you're playing just one card a turn. But remember, your counter spells can still be activated on your opponent's turns and work really, really well under Rule of Law effects. In fact, looking down here, I wanted to see if you are playing. There is a Archon. Let me see if I can find it. Let's go over here. Archon of Ameria. a lot of Amerias here. But Archon of Ameria is a flying creature that says that players can only cast one spell a turn, same kind of thing. So if you wanted to lean into this, you also have a flying creature with this ability to consider. But it will change your deck a little bit, and you have to be aware of that. So outside of that, what else can we do? Well, this one might be a bit tricky because we have a lot of activated abilities, but in a specific build, using something like Suppression Field, or there's a few others, I don't know if it's Jinx Idol, or another one that stops creatures from being able to activate abilities. Suppression Field and these kinds of cards are also very strong. They give a very big tax across the board to all of your opponents that you can kind of build your deck around to not be vulnerable to. Obviously, this one would be a little trickier to build around. On the other hand, we have Torpor Orb. Torpor Orb stops enter the battlefield triggers, and you have considerably less enter the battlefield triggers than one might assume. So yes, this would take some adjustment, but it wouldn't take that much adjustment. Torpor Orb is really, really good here. And I'm also going to suggest that if you can go in and consider how many ETBs you have and reduce them to only the most essential, Hushbringer is also an incredibly playable card. I think people very, very much underestimate the power of Hushbringer in Commander. It is a card that kind of limits the usefulness of your decks, where if you're playing a large amount of ETB cards, you obviously cannot use this. But I just put together a Traxa Blink a few weeks ago. You play Hushbringer, and I'm in a lot of trouble. I think I have very, very little removal that can actually deal with this card, if any. And so being able to play this card will completely shut me out. Alternatively, if you play this card and I'm playing my Aristocrats decks, well, all of a sudden, I can't benefit from that either. So, incredibly powerful card that you get to play. But once again, I would play, in addition to Torpor Orb, as soon as I found out that, yes, I could get away. Like, obviously, Mull Drifter can't be played anymore, but I think that's okay. For what it's worth, I forgot to say something. Dream Trawler also seems kind of weak in this deck. It's just draw a card when it attacks. And I think you can do a lot better. Even with the lifelink, I think it's too restrictive. It's 6 mana. It's very color restrictive. I don't think this card is particularly worth it here. I think you would play better cards for sure. All right, going back with more of the control game, Rest in Peace is another card that you can play and donate a bunch of times that can get rid of all exile. Likewise, Grafdigger's Cage works almost the same way on defeating certain strategies. Something a little weird is Vinelock Orb, which will stop people from searching libraries. Also doesn't matter who controls the artifact, so that'll be very strong. And then here, Solemnity, because once again, I wanted to come back and touch on 9 lives again, can either be used together for the Solemnity 9 lives lock, where you cannot lose the game because Solemnity prevents counters from being put onto artifacts. Sorry, on permanent. Is it everything? It's not players. So artifacts, creatures, enchantments, and lands. So with that, you are just in the game forever, though very, very susceptible to any mass bounce effect because you would lose anyways. But with that in mind, you can just play Solemnity, right? Solemnity is just a strong card. We've seen a lot of +1/+1 decks here recently. And, oh, the first line is players can get counters. I was just reading the second half. I wear glasses, but I promise I'm not blind. So Solemnity also shuts down so many different strategies really, really cleanly. And it doesn't matter who has it, so you can pass these around. So kind of stopping here, I have one more before switching kind of directions, but something to consider, and the reason I've given you so many is this allows you to set up boards where if you have three of these kinds of enchantments or artifacts into play, you can start a cycle where every cycle you are just passing down select cards in a circle and ensuring that only the card you want will come to you. This is really effective of stealing all of the permanents of the player to your right, but sometimes there'll be situations where you want a permanent from the player across from you, quote unquote. You know, the not the next player in line, but the one after. So you can kind of slide their permanents along towards you as well. However, most likely whoever is to your left, it's a lot of effort to get a good card from them. Like if they have Smothering Tide, it's probably better to generous gift it than to let it go to the next player, let it go to the next player, and finally coming to your side. I think that's a little much, but you'll be able to deem whether or not that's worth it. But the important part is almost all of these cards that I've suggested can be passed around in circles indefinitely. You have no problem passing these cards around, and you are going to ideally try to make the most of these exchanges. You know, make them a little less even overall, which is a big theme in deck building, right? Is that we try to find even exchanges and make them uneven. All right, I have a few more. The transition card here is Standstill. If anyone's ever seen Standstill, they know it's kind of a painful card, but it does fit a certain kind of archetype here. I don't know if I would necessarily recommend it, but whenever a player plays a spell, sacrifice Standstill. If you do, each of those players' opponents draw 3 cards. So you play this, and everyone plays chicken. But the really nice part is you just keep passing it around. As long, even like the standstill usually doesn't last a turn cycle, but if it does, you still have game actions because you're still passing cards around, you still have attacks, you should be in a really good situation. So this is actually really easy to play in a deck like this when you have Inniaz out. But let's take a different direction here. Instead of group stacks, let's look at group hug. There's not that many options as much as I thought there would be because a lot of the group HUD cards are in green, surprisingly. But Howling Mine and Font of Mythos, both of which give people extra draws, also work as long as they are on the battlefield, not depending on who they're under. Now, granted, Howling Mine has like a bit of an untapped feature to it, so if you're passing to someone who can tap it for a number of reasons, that might not be great, but otherwise, you should be able to get ahead. So both of these can be passed around. Likewise, oops, I just closed the thing accidentally. Dictate of Crewfix works exactly the same way as players draw an extra card. Helm of Awakening will reduce all spells by 1 mana, no matter who has it, which is also important to remember that Thorn of Amethyst works in the same way, that it doesn't matter. I should have put that in the previous section, but here it is now, that these are both cards that doesn't matter who has, again, so you can pass them around. And then just a few weird ones. Oath of the Liege says that each player will put, if they have less lands than an opponent, they will they will fetch for a land, basic land, and put it into play. This is, I think, definitely playable in your deck because you are the player, you're not in green, so it's likely you don't have the most lands. But there's going to be some boards where this just helps your opponents, maybe. This is why it's in the group hug section, because it does help your opponents, but it also doesn't matter who has control of this card. So no matter what, you can get this effect, and as long as you don't have the most lands, you will always benefit from this effect, which is really, really nice. And unfortunately, the last two aren't anything to write home about, but worth considering. A card like Hive Mind is also always active, no matter which player has control of it. And also, weirdly enough, Forced Fruition, which is whenever an opponent plays a spell, that player draws 7 cards. When you give this to another player, uh, you get to draw 7 cards when you cast a spell. You can't tell, but I'm shrugging. It's a bit of a weird card, to be honest, but it's also kind of really funny. So maybe that could be fun. I'll be honest, I thought I could evenly cut it out as half group hug cards, half group hate cards, or stacks cards, but there really isn't as many group hug cards in these colors than you would think. There are a lot of stacks cards that are worth playing, and I haven't even dug into half of them really. Like that, I would leave to you to look through stacks, looking for stuff like I believe Possessed Portal, if I can find it really easy. Possessed Portal is a card that doesn't matter who has control of it. Granted, if you don't have control of the Possessed Portal, they may sacrifice the Possessed Portal to get out of the lock. So perhaps you don't want that. Omen Machine, is it? I think this is, yeah, Omen Machine works no matter who has it, though the fact that it starts card drawing and your deck is very, very functional at card drawing, I think is not that great. And then, what is, hmm, who is it familiar? There's one, any player may pay life. This is a blue card, I believe. Zor's Weirding, that's what it is. Players play with their hands revealed. If a player would draw a card, they reveal it instead. That any other player may pay 2 life. If they do, it goes in their graveyard. This also doesn't matter whose deck it goes on or whose battlefield it's on, and can be passed around pretty freely, and is a lot of fun because all of a sudden people are constantly becoming incredibly petty and stopping each other from having any draws. All right, I hope some of these cards were fun to you because I I do think a lot of this stuff is rather silly and rather fun and works really well with Inniaz. So, all in all, these are kind of my thoughts. This Inniaz deck, with the addition of the 2 cards that I think are pretty good and maybe a few more indestructibility cards, will be very, very strong. Very consistent, very fun in the sense that you are summoning your birds and you're turning your birds sideways and you're beating your opponents down very cleanly. And then, every now and then, with Inniaz out, you'll be able to cycle a few cards around the circle that can mess up your opponent's game plans by taking like a Blood Artist from me and giving it to the next player, or giving the player after you a bird and hopefully gaining, a big beater or something like that, right? And that can be a lot of fun. But it is a very straightforward strategy where all your birds kind of do the same thing. And like you said, you might get bored. And if you do, I would suggest looking at the other cards I suggested. You don't have to go all the way into a group hate or a group hug deck, but by even starting with cards such as the Darksteel Mutation or Oblivion Ring effects and the like, and being able to pass them around, you will be benefiting from the exchange that Inias provides. And with that, you will have a much more interesting deck, and there will be a lot more thought to it and a lot more gameplay and purpose, right? It's not just a reactive switch around anymore. It is now something that you are affecting. I hope this deck assist video was helpful to you. It was really fun to put together because as soon as I figured out that angle of Innias, I was having a lot of fun seeing what we can do. If you have another draft you'd like to show me, I would love to see it, or any other draft of any other deck. Anyone can send me fill out the form in the video description, and it'll send me the deck. And if you, like Dakota, would like to skip the line and bring your deck to be the next one I work on, there is a link in the video description there as well. And as always, if you could like, comment, subscribe, do that whole thing, I would be very, very grateful. Our channel is still growing, and any support is very much appreciated. I'm really excited to see what the final version of this deck looks like, and I wish you luck in building it.